Zach Brandon, welcome to the Way Champions podcast. It's great to finally coordinate our schedules and get you on, man.
Yeah, John, I appreciate the patience and just the invite in and of itself, and excited to converse today.
Well, I'm a big follower of yours on LinkedIn, where you always post some great stuff, either your own or sharing others. And I think after reading 100 plus of your posts, I'm like, I'm getting him on the podcast. Like, there's too much good stuff here. So, it is your position is with Arizona Diamondbacks as a mental skills coordinator. Maybe just kind of talk about that, and then maybe your pathway. How did you get into this space?
Yeah, I can start here with the current and then maybe work backwards a little bit. So I'm really fortunate. This is going to be year 5 for me in our organization and serving in this role, and really fortunate to basically oversee our mental performance department and work with 2 other full-time mental performance coaches. And our job is in essence what it sounds like, is to help our players optimize their minds at all levels of our organization and help them succeed, not just on the field but off the field as well. And then another piece of that too is we spend a lot of time and energy kind of trying to serve our coaches as well. I think something that we've been really intentional in our communication with coaches in our organization is that they're fundamental to our success, and that it's really kind of this partnership in essence that's going to, I think, allow us to not only have the most impact with our players, but also help them potentially, reach players and help them get to their full potential too. So we work pretty closely with our players and our coaches. And then I guess in terms of walking backwards from that, again, this is year 5, but prior, I spent some time at IMG Academy in Bradenton, Florida, working at a sports academy there. And did that for a couple years, got a chance to learn a lot. I think a common denominator and very fortunate theme that I've experienced in places I've been is to be surrounded by really good people, not only people that are really good at their craft, but also people that are just good human beings. And so I felt that very much so in the time I spent at IMG working with different sports there in a similar role. And then and then prior to that, I did all like my academic training. So my background kind of blends kinesiology, psychology, and got a chance to learn from some great people too along the way. So for me, that's kind of the I guess the formal journey, how it's been. Like everybody's, it's not a linear path as much as we would like it to be, but it's been really cool to learn along the way. And again, I think there's a lot of people to thank for that. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing how IMG has become a breeding ground of people like yourself in professional sports. I mean, off the top of my head, obviously, I know James Leith really well. Justin Sua, Steve Shenbaum, Travis Thomas just worked with the U.S. national team at the World Cup. I mean, there's so many of you. I'm not leaving anyone out on purpose. That's just like what I come to. But what IMG was really good for was getting a lot of reps, right? A lot of teams, a lot of sports, a lot of reps, and sort of honing your message and understanding what people were all about, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the coolest things about being at IMG was the opportunity that we had as practitioners to kind of be embedded within the environment with our teams and the groups that we were serving. And so I think I learned a lot from that perspective. I think sometimes that there's so many different ways in which you can offer mental performance training or work with a mental performance coach, but I think one thing I've appreciated in my stops thus far is when you're immersed in the culture, it's easier to help influence the environment surrounding players. And we know that environment plays such a critical role in ultimately their success. It's not just their personalities, their individual skills, their makeup, their attitude, all of those things certainly are a piece of the pie, but we also know that the culture that's shaped around a team, how their coaches create a learning environment for them, their peers, their parents, like all of those factors come into play. And I think when you're immersed in the environment, there's more opportunity to potentially influence that. And I think that's again where I've become really biased that I love working with coaches. I probably spend more time now than ever working with coaches than I do just players because of how important that influence is on our players' environment.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point because it doesn't matter what you do if a coach is not bought in, it goes right out the window at the next practice or whatever. And so I think this is one of the biggest things. And I have friends who have worked with coaching staffs where there's a lot of alignment with
Mhm.
this and it works great. And I know people who do amazing work and the head coach doesn't want them there. And it's never going to work. It's never going to work out, right? And but I've also had friends who had some resistance and the coach has given them an opportunity. And and at first they're like, you know what, I don't have 10 minutes a day for you in practice. We got way too much on the schedule. And then they watch once or twice and they go, yeah, we're going to make time for you every day. Right.
Yeah.
So earning that trust of coaches is really important part of your job, isn't it?
For sure, for sure. And I think that's where I think there's a few things that have gone into that. I think one just obviously like humility comes into play. I think we have been really intentional with our messaging. Like we don't care if it's our voice or our message specifically coming from us that resonates with a player. We just want to make sure that each player hears the message that they need or gets the help that they need. And we don't care who that comes from, you know. And so if we can empower coaches and work through coaches to tap into that, great. And vice versa. I think sometimes by the nature of our work, we sometimes hear things that other people aren't aware of. Other people maybe they don't feel as comfortable sharing with a coach. And so I think in those instances too, if we may have a deeper bond with somebody, it's an opportunity for us to maybe echo a coach's message or relay that. So I think that happens for us at an individual level, but I also think I work a lot with our coaches pretty regularly of just like, hey, what's the messaging that you're trying to land with the guys right now? How can I echo that? Something that we started doing, and it's been really cool to see how it's trickled down, I think, across the org is we call them like mental minutes. And we basically do these short stories, quick hitters, analogies, etc. And they always have a theme, they always have a principle attached to it. But those themes and those principles are always connecting back to the overarching goals of our staff and what the coaches are trying to land. And like we say, like, you know, it's like you've heard the same message from your dad all these years, and then somebody comes along and says the same thing, but it resonates. Like I think sometimes there's an opportunity for that, not only for them, but also for us too. And we try to bring them into the mix as well with that.
Yeah, it's so important that you're not necessarily an outside voice, but you're also maybe not the day-to-day coaching staff voice that they
Mhm.
hear. And I think that alignment's so important. I know we have other people who do your type of work who listen to this podcast, and certainly Jerry and I work with a lot of teams. And whenever I'm coming in, right, next week I'm going to visit 4 teams that I work with, and I always like meet with the coaches ahead of time. Like, what is the message that you need me to reinforce? Right? What are they hearing from you that I can come in and double down on or give a different perspective on? So that some of them who aren't getting it go, huh? I feel like I've heard that before, right? But that's so important.
Absolutely. I think that ongoing dialogue is essential, right? Like I mean, I think I heard it once, you know, like buy-in can be kind of the catchy buzzword, if you will, and buy-in really is rooted in like can I trust you? Do I trust you? And so I think that happens through communication, it happens through connection, and so I think we're constantly trying to nurture that because we also know that um trust, right, like it's got to be earned. It doesn't just happen overnight. And I think one of the bigger lessons that I've also learned, not only working with coaches but I think players too, is each individual person has their own way of weighing what builds trust with them. For example, like there's different things that build a different level of trust with each person. For some people, you better have some knowledge and you have some content. Like you better have something. They want to know, how can this help me? For other people, they resonate and they feel a sense of trust when you show that connection with them and you get to know them as a whole person and not just who they are, just at the field, but you genuinely show care and compassion for who they are off the field too. And those are two different, things that come into play. And again, they're weighted, and there's other things too, that I think certainly go into it. But I've had to learn a lot that, just because I may have my own default way of building trust with some, they also have their own way of scaling how important that is for them too. And so learning how to kind of, the levels that are needed for both is important.
Yeah, and that comes from their childhood and their upbringing and everything, right? So everything that has gone into building that human being will determine first whether they're quick to trust or slow to trust,
Yeah.
who they trust, right? Is it a big circle? Is it a really small circle? And how they trust. And I think that's so important, right? As a coach of anyone, as a leader of anyone, is trying to understand that about your people and
Mhm.
say, okay, how can I get there? And definitely, I mean, you have a background in baseball. So you have a working knowledge of the sport, maybe better than some people in your field might have. But also, I mean, I don't think you're in the Hall of Fame either. So it's like they might have more baseball ability than you did as well. So it's like, hey, I understand what you have, but I also didn't necessarily get a lot of reps in front of 60,000 people either and feel that. And so how do you balance that? Because I think sometimes it's easier to even go into a room and be like, look, I know nothing about your sport. So let's get that ego out of the way. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the most accurate statement thus far is yes, I'm definitely not in the baseball Hall of Fame. So far, that's the most accurate thing
Yet,
we've said.
yet,
Yeah,
yet.
yeah, yeah. Good point. Good point. That's a great ad. So I think for me, I think one of the most valuable tools that we have as practitioners is the questions that we ask. I believe in that really strongly. It's something that I learned a lot from the mentors and the people that I got to study and observe when I was starting in our profession. And I learned quickly that the questions can really tap into a deeper level of connection and sharing with each person. And so I say that because I leverage questions a lot in the work that I'm doing, with coaches. And I think sometimes I want to hear their experiences. I have not pitched in a big league uniform, in a big league stadium, on a big league mound. But we have coaches that have, and in hearing what their perspectives have been, and then kind of cross-checking that with what I might have an understanding or a knowledge in from either a science standpoint or from a mental skills standpoint, I think is really important because at the end of the day, I think you see it a lot. And I'm just speaking kind of generally here, but you see it where somebody may have the best content, the best principles and knowledge, but if it's not digestible and practical and relevant and contextual, then it often doesn't matter. And so I lean heavily on questions with coaches to try to hear their experiences, but also I use them to troubleshoot my ideas. It's like, hey, like, what do you think about this? Do you think something like this could work? Or here's my idea. How could we make it better?
Mhm.
I'll share another one that I've used with players. So my very first year, I had players on our major league team that I was around that I was like, you've been playing baseball like longer than I've been on this planet. So who am I to come in here and tell you how you should view the mental game or how you should work on it, et cetera. So I really used it as an opportunity to learn from them. And so I was one of my go-tos is I would ask them and say, hey, I just traveled, to one of our minor league affiliates and we have a young pitcher there. He's struggling with X. How have you navigated that? in your career? You know, what are some of the things that you would tell that person, or what are some of the things that you've tried that have helped? And oftentimes, yes, there would be an actual example that I wanted to use what they shared with. And sometimes I would make it up. I just wanted to know what that person thought. And it was a way for me to think about how they conceptualize different things, and how that kind of cross-checked with my own experiences. So I think the questions themselves become really vital, not only with coaches, but with the players too.
Mm. And I think as a coach, sometimes as well, one of the most difficult transitions is sort of getting out of your own way and assuming your experience is the same experience everyone else has, right? So someone who pitched in the major leagues, someone who was an all-star, it might have come a little easier for them, or certain things, right? I see this in soccer with incredibly talented players struggle to teach something because they're like, well, I just figured that out, right? And so when they see someone struggling with something that they never struggled with, it really requires patience and empathy, and that's what makes you a brilliant coach, not your knowledge of the sport or the fact that you could demonstrate it, but can you actually teach it as well? And so I think those questions are just an awesome way to start. And I love your example of like, hey, this is something one of our athletes is dealing with. How did you approach this in your career?
Mhm.
Because we all have that little bit of ego of like, oh, someone wants my advice. Like, how
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah, it kind of came full circle. This was a couple years ago. We had a player that his confidence had really fluctuated. It wasn't what it had been prior at one point in his career. And I was reading this book, and it like really jumped out at me. And this researcher had explored a lot with like things like confidence. And they said that one thing that you want to be careful of is when a person interprets what you're saying to them as like you're giving them advice,
Mm,
because then what it can sometimes signal is that, oh, something is wrong, that
yeah.
there is something to worry about here. And what they said is like they've actually found some interesting research that when you flip it and you ask them for advice, one, not only does that position them as the expert, like you're saying, and then all of a sudden, like there's a little bit of an ego stroke in there, because we know it's probably in there. But the other side of it too is once they say it out loud, now it's also an invitation to hold them accountable to it. Like, hey, you said this, that when you struggled with, when you're encountering X, this is how you've navigated it. And then if you catch them potentially drifting from that, it's now an opportunity to kind of circle back and, hey, these were your words, not mine.
Mm.
But I've used that before, and I've thought about that a lot of, especially for those players where their confidence is waning. And we're in a sport that confidence is fragile, and it does fluctuate. So I think sometimes being mindful of meeting players where they're at and how you position questions and things certainly come into play there.
Yeah. Yeah. I had the performance psychologist Jonah Oliver on the podcast here. He's amazing. I don't know if you've crossed paths with his work. He works a lot in the PGA and Formula One and Le Mans and rugby league and things like that. And he said, people come to him and he's like, the worst thing, you can't convince people that they need help. He goes, you're far better off like, you know, talking through what's going on and what they're doing to overcome fear, stress, anxiety, whatever it is. And then just say, how's that working for you? Right. And that's when they're like, oh God, it's not. I'm a mess. And then like, okay, great. Like maybe I have a couple of tools that will help you work through this. But it's sort of getting them to the point where it's not, this isn't working, because if it was working, I probably wouldn't be in your office anyway. So here we go. And that's got to be a fine balance, because for you, right, you get, I mean, baseball is a streaky sport, and you get someone who's got to hit 10 games in a row. You really don't want to, you just kind of want to get out of their way, right?
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. You want to, and I think it's such a great, I think where, our role sometimes, and a coach serves in this role too, in so many ways, is I think sometimes we're professional reminders,
Mhm.
right? Like when we reflect with players on how they're doing, what's working, what's not working. It's an opportunity for us to kind of note that and use that in the future, because we know that, again, it's going to fluctuate. There's going to be a roller coaster that they encounter across over the course of a season. And so sometimes I think it's an opportunity to go back like, hey, do you remember that conversation we had in January?
Mhm.
And you said that this is when things started to go awry for you, this is what was happening. And here we are, and it's happening again. Well, let's go back. What were some of the things that helped you navigate that previously? I'll give maybe a more concrete example.
Yeah.
So um, an exercise that I learned several years ago when I was actually at IMG, and I've only used it a couple of times in this setting, but I used it recently, and we had a really good conversation with one of our minor league players, and we asked him. We drew up on the whiteboard kind of his year, 2022, from January to December. And we said, on a scale of 1 to 10, I want you to go through and I want you to rate your year. So in January, a scale of 1 to 10, where were you? February, March, etc., down the line. And over time, what we started to see is there was, in essence, that kind of non-linear, like zigzagging. And there was a few really low moments too for him. And as he's sitting here describing each of these events, both the highs and the lows, one of the things that I was listening for is, hey, what is your explanation of some of those low moments? And we started to hear some things like, well, difficulty with managing expectations.
Mm.
We started to hear things like maybe not being surrounded by the best influences or the best kind of support group. And those were just a couple, but what we were able to do is like, look, you're going to encounter these again at some point. The expectations aren't going to go anywhere. But then what we could do is say, what was the thing that helped you kind of jumpstart it and shift it back in a different direction? And they may give whatever that answer might be. And it's like, okay, like now in the future, this is what we can circle back on. These are things that you've navigated before, but we forget. And I think that's where, as coaches, as practitioners, we can really help be kind of those reminders for them. And I think that's something that I've been trying to think about more is with our players, is it's not just your experiences that matter, but it's your explanations of experiences.
The
And
story you
there's
tell yourself for sure.
exactly, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so I think that's where I think we as coaches and staff can kind of have an antenna up for those types of conversations.
Well, I think so much of the inner game is normalizing things. It's
Mhm.
normal to feel fear. It's normal to go through a slump. It's normal. And I like your activity because it's like, oh, look, you were here and guess what? The world didn't end. And actually you were back at a 9 6 weeks later.
Yeah.
So you've dug yourself out of this before and you'll do it again. Because when you're in a low moment as a human being, that's when your your brain's a mess, your internal voice is beating you down, and that ability to say okay, and I think again for a baseball hitter, it's like it's not that you're never going to um have a bad streak. It's just keeping it short, right? And not pressing too much. But let me ask you a question because this is interesting to me because your work spans everything from major leaguers who are making millions to single A just trying to make it. They have different fears, anxieties, stresses, right? Someone's got a 10-year guaranteed contract and someone's wondering what happens if I don't get to play baseball next year. And so you really have to look at the individual, don't you? And say, what do they need from me? Because it's not the same thing.
Completely. I think that's a really great point. It's kind of a timely one in essence. We've gone through and we've done some exercises recently in some different groups, both with players and staff, where we've kind of talked a little bit about what are some of the challenges that are maybe unique to every level, right? There's
Mm,
obviously challenges that are very specific within the game of baseball that doesn't matter the level, but we also know that there's some of these outside forces and things that do make A ball AAA to the big leagues, all of those a little bit different. And
Can
so
you
I
talk a couple specifics? I mean, I have things that pop into my head, but
Yeah, of course, of course. I mean, I think one initially, right, for like the A-ball guys is it's a big transition period for those guys. You're going to either have college level players that are adjusting now to being a professional for the
mhm,
first time. Like I am getting paid to be a baseball player, and with
mhm,
that becomes really it's kind of a 24/7 commitment, you know,
mhm,
all of your choices, not only at our complex and at our field and at the field are going to kind of matter in how you're able to do what you're capable of on the field. So I think there's that transition period for those guys learning how to be a professional, learning how to create a routine around being an everyday kind of player. You know, in
mhm,
college, you play on the weekends generally with maybe some midweek games mixed in. High school, it's similar, but even on a lesser scale.
mhm,
And so I think learning how to create a routine and play nightly, I think in a sport that's so unique in that you're in essence having to prepare and train on the same night you're getting evaluated and you're asked to
mhm,
compete. And that's a really difficult thing because um, we know, you know, even just from a as a slight sidebar of how people learn effectively, right? Like it's you're going to have to go outside your comfort zone. There's a lot of things with skill acquisition in terms of creating more simulating and making it the practice environment more representative of the challenges in a game. So we're seeing that more and more. And our coaches are doing a phenomenal job of training our players to get, you know, more uncomfortable or get more comfortable being uncomfortable. And so I say that because the challenge though is you're doing that at, you know, maybe 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock during batting practice, but now also you're going to have to go do it in the game too. And that can be challenging for some. So I think for younger guys, those are some of the things that become a part of conversations and how you help them. How do you help them see? I think perspective comes into play. How do you treat every single day and kind of define success for your day? Irrespective of the box score
mhm.
sometimes because yes the results matter but we know that that's not how you can't control most
Right.
of that.
If you hit four line drives and they go right at someone, you're swinging
Yeah,
okay.
correct,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think for younger levels I think those are a couple that immediately jumped out as challenges, and then I think at the upper levels you bring into generally I think there's other dynamics certainly into play. You know, you start having um families involved, right? You're now dependent, like other people are dependent on you that maybe that
Mhm,
weren't always the case at the minor league level. Yes, contract situations come into play, which can be a big source of stress for some. And I think I heard it recently from a of an ex-player from another organization, and he made the comment about how the window of opportunity for today's player is much smaller than it used to be. That we're living in this world where the average lifespan of a Major League Baseball player isn't the same as maybe it had been previously. And so with that too, there's added pressure, there's added expectation, there's added sense of urgency, which can kind of drive us to a degree, and it can also create a lot of tension and lack of freedom in how we navigate too. So I think those are things that start to become a little bit more apparent as guys advance to the higher levels.
yeah. No, I think all that is fascinating. What about social media? What about the ability of Joe Public to get in your head? Because that didn't happen 20 years ago either. And, we've had NBA coaches on this podcast talking about, trying to get guys off Twitter at halftime because, and I'm your coach. You've known me 9 years. Oh, but some guy on Twitter said I suck, and they weigh it the same way. I mean, and I don't even think the human brain isn't really equipped to take the opinion of 1,000 people or 100 people.
For sure. I think for social media, for me, I think there's two vantage points that it comes for that I think about. I think one is as it relates to our attention, right? Like the price of our attention. It's the most valuable, I think, resource our players have. It's probably the number one skill that we talk about with our guys. And every minute you spend on social media, you're gambling away your attention because, right, you're scrolling, and next thing you know, you can go down a rabbit hole of something that's maybe not productive, that's maybe what can feel like you're relaxing and kind of letting the mind just wander. But then all of a sudden you read something that strikes a chord and it triggers
Mm,
something. And next thing you know, you're basically just gambling your attention and your well-being. And you in a thing much like in baseball that you have very little control over what your feed says. So I
mhm.
think that's one. I think the other thought though, and this came from I thought about this a few years ago. We had a pitcher who one of the things that he was struggling with was he felt as though when he would do his post-game interviews, he felt like he wasn't he felt like he'd lose some of his power from it. He felt like he was giving the same kind of standard cookie cutter answers, but he wasn't really using that time to kind of create the actual narrative and the story that he wanted to. It kind of goes back to our thing around explanations.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that we kind of started to talk a little bit about were what were going to be his core themes that he wanted to make sure he broadcasted, not just for the public, but for himself, right?
Mm,
And we started to view the post-game interview as his way of not only putting a period at the end of his night, but also making sure that he was setting himself up for the next game. Like, hey, the next game starts now with what I tell myself.
mm,
And again, it kind of goes back to some of those stories that you described earlier, which ultimately shape our identity. And so we can either allow other people to dictate that for us, or we can choose to kind of write our own narrative. But I think that what's important with that is sometimes you have to be intentional and
mm.
think about it, in advance, because in the moment, after maybe a bad performance, we all tend to be our own biggest critics and really
Right.
harsh on ourselves. And so sometimes we're not operating from the right headspace to kind of start to turn the page for the next one.
And I think that's really important for coaches to remember as well, that when someone's had a bad game, when someone's made a mistake, um, they're usually their own worst critic. They're very aware. I'm very aware I just gave up a home run. I don't need anyone to remind me of that, right? Um, and so those are those moments where it's much more important to be sort of empathetic or say nothing, right? I'm like, come on, you know, you got this. But it's yet as a coach, our instinct is, I forget, I think it's Stephen Roll, Nick calls it the writing reflex. We want to fix the deficit. We want to do that. And it's like, you know, in that moment, like that's maybe the worst thing we could do.
Yeah, I've heard from, again, mentors that sometimes silence is the best response,
Right.
and really what I want to say it's a Brene Brown TED Talk or maybe one of her specials, but she made a comment that I saw one time that really just like really resonated, and I'm gonna butcher it exactly, so it wasn't this word for word. But what she in essence said is that when people are experiencing these really negative or uncomfortable emotions, we sometimes the writing reflex says, I'm going to come in and I want to say something to alleviate what you might be feeling here and take some of that burden off. But really, what they really want, without maybe saying it, is people just want you to be with them in that space. They want to know that they're not alone, as you kind of mentioned earlier. And so sometimes silence is one of the best ways that you can do that because it invites them to share or not share as little as you can. I've seen, who I've seen be really good at that in our organization is strength coaches. I think some of our strength coaches, where when a player's game and night is over, they might come in and finish up a workout or get their workout in before they go home. And I think our strength coaches sometimes do an unbelievable job of feeling the room and knowing, hey, do I say something here, or do I just stay silent and see if something emerges? And so I think any of us, whether you're a practitioner or you're a coach, that it can be awkward, but it can also be the most valuable tool along with questions that
Yeah.
you.
How can I be a better coach for you in this moment? What do you need from me? I also saw, I mean, teammates as well. I saw we're recording this right before the Super Bowl, but there was something going around social media of the Bengals player who committed the penalty that let the Chiefs kick the winning field goal. And he was sitting on the bench afterwards, and everyone else left the field, right? Everyone, the coaches are gone or whatever, and he's still sitting on the bench, and there's just one teammate hanging with him. And I thought it was a really cool picture, a really cool image of, and I think it was Terrell Owens or someone commented on it, like, we've all been there. We've all felt like we let our team down. And that's when we need our teammates the most. That's when we need our coaches the most, not after the win and touchdown or the win and run, but when I feel like I've let my brothers down, my sisters down, that's when we need to show camaraderie and love and belonging.
Yeah, I think you're right. It was a wonderful snapshot of a moment that I know for that individual was less than ideal in so many ways. But I think it's a good reminder too of how obviously in that moment, right, there was kind of a spotlight on it. I mean, it's a playoff game. There's a lot of watchers, and then obviously you have the media and how it's casted. But in general, though, I think what you find is that most people walk around thinking that they're walking under a spotlight.
Hmm.
Most of us walk around being like, oh, if something doesn't go well, if I don't do my job right, other people are thinking about their spotlight is on me and what I should have done, what I should have said, how I should have done this differently, etc. And the reality is that every person generally has the same thought, and they're not casting their spotlight on somebody else. Most often they're casting it too on themselves. And I think it's a good reminder that thankfully, maybe not everybody, but I would say the majority of people recognize that when you see a teammate struggle with something like that, the inclination is to go and to support them and to kind of be kind of that compassionate friend and whatnot. And yet we don't do that for ourselves. And so I think that's a good reminder too with it as well, is that if any of us were perfect, as much as we beat ourselves up, like we'd probably be perfect by now. And yet we
Hmm.
aren't. And so sometimes we have to extend the same grace to ourselves as we do to others.
Yeah, I like that word, grace. I often find myself in moments like that, not just on the sporting field, but in life, quoting Dr. Seuss that the people who matter don't mind, and the people who mind don't matter. That's one of my favorite quotes, and I that's up on my wall because it's easy paying attention to the people who don't matter to really mess with your head, but the people who matter usually they're fine with it.
For sure. For sure.
Yeah,
I completely
yeah.
agree.
Did you let me talk again at the level you're working at now, and then I want to kind of maybe dive back into your past as a player. But um I mean, I think it's really important. I'm always trying to tell young athletes that the people you're watching on TV feel stress, feel anxiety, feel fear for whatever the reason behind it, all the things we've talked about. Um and the thing is, at their level, you're just building capacity to deal with harder things. You're building capacity to embrace the fear, not neglect it, not try to force it to go away, because that's not helpful. It's just, okay, it's there. It means I care. It means it matters. It means I'm alive. Welcome. Right. Talk about that for a second, because I think a lot of parents come to me and like, oh, my 12-year-old scared. I'm like, good. It means he cares. What are your
Uh,
thoughts?
I would agree. I think it was really well said in that. And I think I would love for people to stop telling others to be fearless,
Yeah.
because just no, I don't think any of us are going to be successful
Yeah.
accomplishing that or reaching that point. And I think you touch on a couple of like really important things. I think when I think about stress, you're right. Our players experience it at all levels of the organization, and it looks different. Again, sometimes the source is different. And I think one of my favorite adages around stress is that we only stress about the things that we truly care about, right? And so when you think about it, if it's not that important to you, generally it's no sweat, right? You don't
Mhm.
even concern yourself with it. But when it's something that we value, when it's something that we truly care about, when that becomes at stake, when that gets challenged or threatened, that's when all of a sudden that stress barometer tends to go up.
Mhm.
And I think it's an invitation for people to remind themselves of exactly, you care because something that is important to you is at stake. And so I
Mhm.
think sometimes for us, what we like to do, and I thought two of our other mental performance coaches, Sydney Masters and Charlie Joust, they recently engaged in a kind of a roundtable discussion with some of our minor league players around values. And they actually did an exercise with them. And it was really cool to see these players from all different walks of life describing just in essence what's important to them. But what it started to do is it started to create a new definition of success. And I think that that's something that we've tried to encourage players to do is find alternative ways to define success again outside of just the results. Because the analogy that I've come up with is there's two scoreboards that you're often playing against. There's
Mhm.
society's scoreboard, which
Mhm.
is fame, fortune, accolades, on-field success, performance, metrics, etc. And then there's your personal scoreboard.
Mhm.
And now I don't get to choose what your personal scoreboard has on it, and you don't get to
Mhm.
choose what your my personal scoreboard has on it. But what is on it is our values.
Mhm.
What's on it is the things that truly matter to us. And for us, those become a new way to evaluate your day to day. And that again, it doesn't mean or take away the fact that the results matter. They do. And yet, what they should hopefully do is give us something that's more process oriented,
Mhm.
something that's more something more controllable.
Yeah.
And again, it changes our barometer for success. And I think that that's something that's important because when you know what you do care about, it's a lot easier to be free of the things that you don't care about.
Yeah, I love that, and I think it's so important. I want to reemphasize it, and I think the terminology Jerry and I use a lot is sort of showing up to compete versus showing up to win, right? Because showing up to compete is very controllable. My nutrition, my sleep, my focus, my preparation, my practice, all these things, I own them, right? Versus showing up to win, right? The other pitcher, the other team, the umpires, the weather, the fans, all these things are out of my control. And if I'm focused on all that, and if my only validation comes from that societal scoreboard, I'm in big trouble because you can't teach people how to win, right? We misuse that term, I think, a lot, right? When we should say, oh, we can teach you how to compete, and with the tools you have in the moment, we can help you perform your very best. And you still might not win because someone else is just better.
Sure.
And I think that is the kind of things, these are messages that we have to teach starting at a younger age, because I'm sure you see people who have whose only self-worth is I'm a winner. I'm a winner. I'm a winner. And then all of a sudden you stop winning. Then that other scoreboard starts to spiral out of control.
For sure. And then I think with it, it can start to stunt action, right? Where it can start to stunt your willingness to step outside your comfort zone. It can
Mm,
start to stunt your willingness to take a risk, right? And this is veering into the trail around like things like a growth mindset and all that. But it's it becomes really relevant where if that's become the story that you're attached to, if that's become your identity, the moment that gets threatened, well, wait a second, this isn't comfortable for me. This isn't who I am. This isn't what I do. And so I'm less inclined to do some of the things that we know are maybe the ingredients to get closer to winning, and now I'm less inclined to actually pursue those.
I mean, amen. And I think that's it right there. And parents, if you're listening, coaches, if you're listening, it's up to you. It's up to the adults with young children to create creative risk takers, if you will. And the only way you do that is not put so much emphasis on the outcome, just on, hey, great that you tried that, because that's hard. Right. And in baseball, I'm sure there was, right, things, you were a pitcher, right? That, I can do certain things when I'm a young pitcher that will help me this year, but it's not going to help me over the long term get people out when when I have to do something different.
Correct. Yeah, yeah. I'll give two quick anecdotes. These are two things that I've learned from two guys on our major league team. I asked one of them if you could give advice to anybody at the start of their career. This was around the draft last year, and I asked him, what advice would you tell somebody just starting? And he said, for all my life, I was told how difficult and hard the big leagues would, like how hard it was at the big league level. And he's like, the reality is like, yes, it is hard, but he was like, it's not as hard sometimes as we make it out. And the reason, what basically he summed it up with is, he's like, my career took off the moment I changed my relationship with failure, the
Mm.
moment I started to think about failing forward. And then we had a player recently address some of our minor league players in kind of a discussion, and that was one of the first comments he made. He's like, your career is going to start when you fail. Like, that's when your career really starts. And so your relationship with it, with failure, a word that has like a very visceral reaction for most of us. None of us want to fail. None of us want to be considered a failure. But really, that's where there's an opportunity to kind of live in a space of freedom, is ultimately by the relationship you choose to have with it.
And it's this idea of, we all can be victims of some things, right? I might blow my ACL, I might have a horrible family situation, but then it's this choice of, do I live a life of victimhood or not? And I think failure is very similar. I'm going to experience this. Now I have a choice. Did that define me? Or is that, like you said, failing forward? And I love this idea of when you change your relationship with that, not as something to avoid, but actually something to seek out,
Mm.
right? The more I fail, the faster I learn, the better I get, the better my shot, right? And that's a pretty powerful way to go about, not just in sports, but in life.
Completely. No, I would completely agree.
Of all the things you've learned now, IMG and 5 years working with in professional baseball, um, what do you wish someone had told you when you were 12, 14, 16, 20?
Oof, that's a great question.
I should have prepped you with that one. Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Gosh, I think there's a, yeah, I mean, what I like though about this question is I'm pretty sure my answer changes every time I answer it.
Yeah.
It's one of those where the timing, right, where you're at in your career, your life can come into play here. But I think what I will say, that two things that have really kind of stood out for me that I've learned is, one, there's no formula. There's no singular way. I think you see that, you can look at a major league roster and you're going to see 26 different personalities. You're going to see 26 different sets of strengths, different physical compositions, different makeups. And sometimes, quite frankly, some of them don't align with what are often the industry kind of best practices, or kind of common thoughts. And I'll give you an example. Like, I
Yeah,
mean,
like
I've
he
seen.
looks like a player type thing, that kind of stuff. Yeah, yeah.
Sure, sure. And even from like a mental standpoint, like, I mean, we have some guys that are extremely motivated. They're very high achievement. They set goals for themselves, and yet maybe they haven't quite reached their full potential and they're underperforming. And then we have some players that are incredibly talented, incredibly skilled, and have performed unbelievable. And you'd be amazed that they're maybe not always the most motivated in the
Mm,
same way that, we would kind of be led to believe that all the best guys do. And so I think anytime somebody tries to push the notion that, hey, this is the one way that it should be done, whether that be a person's path to the big leagues, whether that be how you do mental performance work, how you coach, etc. I would raise a flag there and say, hey, proceed with caution.
mm,
And then I think the one other thing that I have seen is I've really started to make note of, we like discipline is a word that gets thrown around a lot, I think, and I
mhm,
think it's fair to say that there are some incredibly highly skilled players at the highest level that you could point to being disciplined. But I think sometimes the verbiage around it is in this notion of being really persistent,
mm,
being really kind of persevering through the different obstacles and how you respond and all that. But I think sometimes discipline is forgotten in that like subtraction, it's not just addition. And
mm,
that sometimes learning to do, I hate to be careful in how I say this, doing less, but learning to identify what's essential for
mhm,
you and
mhm,
just doing that sometimes really well is
mhm,
important. I think about it even from a practitioner standpoint. I have had some failures as a practitioner in conversations with players when I felt the need to keep adding, to keep giving them more things to do, or I kept asking more and more when I kept talking the whole time when I should have been listening and I should have
mhm,
been um, identifying what was most important to them and trimming from there. And I think that's something that I see guys who have some longevity to their careers. They've learned how to kind of cut out some of the excess, and
mm,
I think that that's something that I just for a long time was like, hey, like all this mental game stuff is great. Everybody should be doing it and you should be doing it every single day in your routine. And it's like, no, there's no singular way. And
mm.
and I think sometimes it's about addition by subtraction.
There is a great book just called Less But Better. I don't know if you've seen it, and I really have loved that book of what are the things you can't do it all. So what are the things that have the greatest impact on performance? Do those really well, right? And if you have the moment, add something else, but not really. Like you can't do it all. And I see that, right? We have this I think it's an American ethos, and we see it in tech and we see it in sports. You got to grind. If you're not practicing, someone else is. I'm like, you need to sleep, right? You need a day off so you can recover, right? And I think what happens in American youth sports is because kids are just going, 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 and they're sold this myth, right? They never have a really hard day. They never practice at 100% because they're never recovered, and they never recover, and so they tend to just go along at 70% day
Mhm.
after day after day. And what we know is that it's the super intense followed by recovery where learning and improvement happens. And so we actually slow down improvement by not taking a day off, by not relaxing. I also heard, and then I'll let you jump on that. He was a top rugby player. I think he was a guy in All Blacks, and I forget about him, but he talked about like, he had his journal of what he was going to practice. And he would kick tries at the end of every practice. And he always did 10, never more, never less. Right. And he's like, so on the day, if I missed 5, I still was done after 10 because I knew I'll come back for 10 tomorrow. But you get in that thing of like, oh, I'm doing really badly today. I'm going to stay here until I get it right. And then I just go in that downward spiral versus I just do 10 every day. And as long as I do 10 every day, I'm going to be just fine.
Yeah, I mean, that's again discipline, right? It's the discipline to know when to stop and temperance, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
think those all make total sense to me, and I think I'm not trying to go on a soapbox here or anything like that, but I think we're at a point where we probably can stop romanticizing the grind, because I
Mm,
think what I've learned is I think there's a difference between like peak performance and high performance, and they're both very buzz termy-ish. But where somebody asked me recently, how do you distinguish those two? And my view on it is peak performance is more like in the moment and in a singular performance, whereas high performance is consistency and sustainability over time. And I think when you think about grinding, generally that doesn't land in the camp of sustainable.
Yeah.
It's really difficult to show up every day grinding, and we're in a sport, and it's not the only one. There's other sports, there's other professions and lives. I mean, you could say the same with coaches. Grinding it out isn't sustainable.
Mm.
And over time you start to burn, I think, the candle from both ends. And now I think you're starting to hear, I think more and more people are talking about coach well-being and coach burnout and practitioner burnout, those things. I think those are really important. Obviously, we're mainly focusing on athletes here, but I think it applies for all of us.
Mhm.
And so I'm with you 100% that this notion of toughness, this notion of grind, we also have to make sure it's that recovery is kind of built into it too. Because otherwise, like you said, you're going to be riding you're more inclined to ride a roller coaster on an empty battery. And that's just, it's not going to lend itself well for the long haul.
Yeah, and then it becomes this physical decline and the mental decline, and it all kind of starts spiraling downwards. And then what are they told? Press more, do more, whatever, and it just becomes perpetuating the problem instead of take a deep breath, take a
For
day
sure.
off, take a week off, whatever. Yeah, and I see it a lot. I see it with young kids, and I agree with you. I like that. We have to stop romanticizing the grind, and that's not because hard work doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's just hard work as part of an entire plan of athletic human improvement and high performance. That's when hard work is it has its place, but it's not everything.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Love it. Well, this was a great talk, Zach. Where's the best place for people to sort of connect with you, follow your work? I mean, like I said, I follow you on LinkedIn, but if someone wanted to reach out or just connect and see the work you do, I highly recommend your LinkedIn page, and I get lots of great stuff off there. So, what do you think?
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe I'm shameless to say that I'm sorry for filling up the spam of everybody's feed on social media, because I do probably post more than I should, but it's most often it's just reminders for myself. But LinkedIn is a good one for sure, for any like professionals. And then I do have Twitter, Instagram. I'm less involved with, but I do have it. So either of those, whatever you feel
Is
like
it
is.
just your name, or what's
Yeah,
Twitter?
so Twitter is MVP_mindset,
Okay.
and then Instagram is MVP_mind. So but yeah, so either of those, but LinkedIn for sure. LinkedIn is probably the best from a professional standpoint if there's anybody that wants to talk shop or share ideas and stuff. I'm always happy to throw some logs on the fire with them.
Awesome. Perfect. We'll throw all that in the show notes so people can connect. We appreciate you carving out some time here in the middle of your busy schedule, but this was a really enjoyable talk, and we could have gone on and on and on and unpacked your childhood, but we'll save that one for now.
That sounds good. That sounds good. That would be a very short, boring one. So we'll
Yeah.
we'll hold that one. But thanks, John. Appreciate
Awesome,
you
Zach.
having me.
Thanks for being on. Well, that was awesome, everyone. Thank you to Zach Brandon. Again, you can find him at MVP_mindset, or at that's on Twitter, at MVP_mind on Instagram, and just look him up on LinkedIn as well. But really, really great conversation. So thank you all to our Patreon podcast champions. Thank you to our friends at Sprocket Sports. Reminder again, we just opened registration for the 2023 Way of Champions Conference. It's coming up. It's going to be amazing. August 4th, 5th, and 6th in Denver, Colorado. book your hotel, secure that, get signed up for the conference now, because it's just going to be where we've learned so much the last couple of years, and it's going to be unlike any other conference we've done. So thank you all for listening. Remember, your influence is never neutral. So go out there, change the world, make a difference, make a positive difference in the lives of your athletes, of your coaches, of your teammates. We'll see you again next week.